The model marriage of Martin Luther.
The 16th century in Europe witnessed an unprecedented period of social upheaval, unrest, rebellion, and warfare, the Protestant Reformation, which astonishingly lasted for 130 years. This movement successfully fractured not only the Catholic Church but also the body of Christ itself. In an era where the ecumenical movement is championed as politically correct, abandoning hearsay and confronting historical facts becomes an act of rational faith. Among the most trivial aspects of that regrettable past is arguably the topic of clerical marriage. This issue is so straightforward it leaves no room for debate, and to outsiders, it likely appears most comical essentially, a lustful monk achieving enlightenment. Since the Bible offers no clear stance on this matter, there's no need to belabor the point. Simply examining the outcomes is enough to make everything clear. The Catholic Church has always promoted clerical celibacy, including for monks and nuns. Celibacy is seen as a noble spiritual state. Marriage, on the other hand, is for secular individuals to have children and continue their lineage. Various illicit sexual relationships are condemned and linked to the evil of original sin. Therefore, monastic vows, including the vow of chastity, are considered sacred, inviolable, and binding, with any violation being a grave offense within the faith. Online, one frequently encounters phrases like Martin Luther's model marriage. Yet, the specific content of this model is never explained. The reasons for this omission are likely: 1. Based on the hagiography surrounding Martin Luther, the goal is simply to heap praise upon him, regardless of its appropriateness. 2. People merely repeat what they hear without seeking deeper understanding. In other words, they prefer to believe hearsay rather than delve into historical sources. Therefore, it becomes entirely logical and appropriate to scrutinize the issue of clerical marriage more closely here.
1. Martin Luther's stance on marriage.
Martin Luther, a man who habitually disregarded consequences, was once a Catholic cleric. However, to the Catholic Church that had nurtured him, he was inherently an anomaly, later a renegade. By carelessly indulging his rebellious spirit, he was exploited and became the leader of the Protestant Reformation, a rebellious figure who turned against those who had shown him grace. As an ordinary Catholic priest, Martin Luther dared to challenge papal authority and Catholic doctrine. This was likely something many people only dreamed of doing, and it was certainly what many of his predecessors had been condemned and punished for. After the Catholic Church repeatedly tried to win him back with earnest appeals to no avail, he was finally excommunicated for heresy and expelled from the Church. He was also declared an enemy of the state by the Holy Roman Empire, subject to death by anyone. Since Martin Luther was no longer part of the Catholic Church, its rules should presumably no longer have held sway over him. Yet, he chose not to return to lay life but continued his clerical duties. It's unclear who granted him the authority to do so or by what rules this was permitted. Furthermore, his lifelong vow of chastity at the time was largely a personal commitment. In this context, choosing to marry would seem inappropriate. Even if Protestant clerical marriage was legalized, that happened after the formal establishment of Protestantism, belonging to the future tense. Therefore, Martin Luther's marriage evidently lacked legal basis. From the perspective of traditional social norms at the time, this marriage was undoubtedly a huge scandal. In 1505, Martin Luther joined the Augustinian order and, as was customary, took the triple vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. At that time, marriage was entirely out of the question for him. In 1522, Martin Luther published his first formal treatise on married life. This act immediately broke his vow of obedience. He attacked the value of celibacy vows, advocating that marriage was the best Christian life. He even specifically followed St. Augustine's threefold purposes for marriage, established a millennium earlier: procreation, avoiding sin, and mutual help and companionship. He summarized these as children, fidelity, and love. However, St. Augustine did not advocate for clerical marriage. On the contrary, after his baptism at age 33, he committed to a life of celibacy as a servant of God for the rest of his days. Theologically, Augustine believed that a celibate chaste life was inherently superior to marriage. In his work on holy virginity, he stated that chastity was a gift of God and a greater gift than marriage, though not as great as martyrdom. He considered chastity to be sharing the life of angels. Although Augustine acknowledged marriage as good, viewing it as a legitimate means for procreation and guiding sexual desire, He personally chose celibacy and established rules of celibacy for the monastic communities he founded, including communities of clergy. Therefore, his teachings supported clerical celibacy, not marriage. It's unclear whether Martin Luther understood the immense negative repercussions of clerical marriage. For example, 1. How can one be a chaste believer and also enjoy conjugal intimacy? 2. Should a married cleric dedicate their time to serving God or caring for their family? 3. With marriage and a family, does one acquire private property? Doesn't this violate the vow of poverty? 4. What happens if the couple's relationship sours? 5. What if the children turn out to be unfilial? 6. What if the family is unwilling to endure a lifetime of poverty? 7. What happens if they seek a divorce? All these negative effects of clerical marriage are not merely issues of personal moral conduct. They also concern the image of the church, and, if mishandled, could even be a blasphemy against God. After all, the widespread appearance of lustful monks would be a laughingstock. Any issue has multiple facets. Emphasizing only one aspect is either naive or a sign of rampant metaphysical thinking. There are still absolute truths in the world. These are, the minority obeys the majority, and the subordinate obeys the superior. When it comes to clerical marriage, Christian congregants have the most say. If the majority believes that lustful monks are impure, then this becomes the truth. One can imagine that when a lustful monk presides over a sacrifice, people would either drive him off the altar or the congregants would simply disperse and leave. Doesn't the marriage of a former monk and a former nun strike you as very strange?
2. The union with Katharina von Bora.
In German, the von in a signifies nobility. Thus, Katharina von Bora hailed from an aristocratic family. A common characteristic of these declining noble families is cynicism and world-weariness. However, it's unclear to what extent Sister Katharina possessed such traits. Katharina von Bora was a former professional nun. She entered a convent at just 9 years old. She developed a keen interest in the burgeoning Reformation movement. Consequently, she conspired with several other nuns and, with Martin Luther's help, secretly escaped from the convent in 1523. While Luther arranged marriages or work for most of these nuns, Katharina herself remained unsettled. It's said that she once told another reformer, Nikolaus von Amsdorf, that she would only marry Luther or Amsdorf. Initially, Martin Luther himself, along with many of his friends, were unsure whether he should marry. Some friends, such as Philip Melanchthon, even worried that it would damage the Reformation by causing scandal. However, Luther ultimately decided his marriage would please his father, enrage the Pope, make the angels laugh, and the devils weep. On June 13, 1525, 26-year-old Katharina von Bora officially married 41-year-old Martin Luther. Such a political marriage likely had the seeds of disaster sown from the very beginning. People often say that marriage is the grave of love. If a clerical couple experiences discord after marriage, they are forced to endure it for political reasons. Divorce is not an option. The marriage itself was probably a huge scandal, and divorce would have been an even greater one. The 15-year age difference between them virtually guaranteed that the couple would find harmony challenging. Furthermore, both the bride and groom were professional monastics, generally unfamiliar with secular life. The bride, having grown up within convent walls, was typically naive about worldly affairs. For such a marriage to be harmonious would be close to a miracle. Such a union would likely be unavoidable, fraught with moral conflicts.
3. Immoral accusations.
At the time of his marriage, Martin Luther had been a hunted man. For years, his life constantly in peril. Understandably, his emotional state was severely compromised, and he suffered from poor health, including severe depression. If premarital medical examinations had existed then, he certainly would not have passed. Historical records indicate that Luther was plagued by various ailments throughout his life, including kidney stones, vertigo, heart problems, and severe constipation. His physical condition was consistently poor. There are also numerous archival records detailing his severe depression. Many of his illnesses were hereditary. Given these circumstances, he was indeed unsuited for marriage. His reckless decision to marry, despite these issues, arguably violated moral principles, showing a lack of responsibility towards his wife and children. As it turned out, when Martin Luther passed away at the age of 63, his wife and children faced extreme hardship, largely relying on charity to survive. Regarding Luther's cause of death, Protestants claim it was due to a myocardial infarction or stroke. This account is based on records from his close friends, family, and doctors. However, some voices within the Catholic community suggest he committed suicide after heavy drinking. This latter claim originates from printed pamphlets, not official Vatican statements. Both versions have their credibilities and incredibilities, as they come from two opposing camps during that era. Moreover, information online is often biased, functioning as a one-sided forum. The Protestant side is verbose and articulate. The Orthodox Catholic side remains silent and tight-lipped. As for the Catholic Church's official reluctance to speak out online, it's likely due to a desire to avoid impropriety and prevent missteps. However, unofficial voices should presumably not be suppressed. Given these differing views on the marriage of a former monk and nun, it's worth delving deeper into the bride's story as well.
4. The person of Katharina von Bora.
Katharina von Bora transformed from a professional nun dedicated to God's sacred work into a housewife devoted to daily chores. Whether this was a positive or negative transformation is something posterity will likely continue to debate. She was born on January 29, 1499, into a landed gentry family in Saxony, eastern Germany. By then, her family's fortunes had declined, and they lived in near poverty. Her mother died of illness, and her father subsequently remarried. This remarriage is believed to be the reason she was sent to a convent at the tender age of 9, some say 5. This was a common practice among aristocratic families at the time for superfluous daughters, aiming to reduce the family's financial burden and avoid providing a dowry. In that era, a woman could not marry without a dowry, and remaining an old maid was socially despised as a disgrace. She was initially sent to a convent for her early education. 4 years later, she was transferred to another convent where 2 of her aunts were already nuns. Therefore, her family could be considered a lineage of nuns. In 1515, at age 16, Katharina took her vows, officially becoming a nun. She swore vows of silence, poverty, and charity. Life in the convent was rigorously disciplined. Nuns began their work before sunrise each day. They followed a strict schedule of 8 daily prayer services, matins starting at 2 a.m., followed by prayers at 4 a.m., 7 a.m., 9 a.m., 12 p.m., 3 p.m., 5 p.m., and 7 p.m. Between prayers, they engaged in spiritual reading and physical labor such as farming, cooking, and cleaning. Conversation and private property were largely forbidden. Within the convent, the nuns observed and participated in gardening, food production, animal husbandry, and hospitality, learning how to make the community self-sufficient. Katharina also gained considerable experience in caring for the sick, later proving to be an excellent nurse. Despite the convent's strict enclosure, which largely isolated it from the outside world, the emerging Protestant ideas still permeated its high walls. Printed materials often made their way in secretly. At that time, many convents faced pressure to close or dissolve during the Reformation, which led some nuns to leave their orders. Consequently, Katharina and 11 other nuns secretly escaped from their convent on Easter Eve in 1523 by hiding in a wagon transporting herring. The act of Katharina von Bora and others secretly fleeing the convent was considered a grave crime under the laws and ecclesiastical regulations of the time, facing very severe penalties, including excommunication from the church and even potential punishment by secular authorities. Even without legal sanctions, nuns who escaped the convent would face immense social ostracism and moral condemnation. In reality, only a very small number of restless individuals were swayed by these ideas. The vast majority of nuns held deep class affection for their convents. After all, leaving the convent and returning to secular life was a devastating blow, and many nuns found it difficult to adapt to worldly life. This was especially true for German women, who even today often have a low social standing in the family and change their surname upon marriage. As for whether Katharina's choice was impulsive, that remains unknown. However, from the perspective of bearing and raising children, this nun was clearly serious.
5. Procreation amidst precariousness.
Martin Luther was excommunicated by the Catholic Church and condemned as a traitor by secular authorities, making him fair game for anyone to kill. A sword of Damocles constantly hung over his head, his life perpetually in danger. Living such a precarious and terrifying existence was certainly not conducive to marriage and raising children. Yet, for reasons unknown, They not only married but had children without restraint. Aside from one miscarriage, they had 6 children in quick succession. 1. Johannes Luther 1526–1575. He studied theology at university but later turned to law, living to 49. His cause of death is unknown. 2. Elizabeth Luther 15–715–8. She died shortly after birth, surviving only a few months, likely due to prematurity or infant illness. 3. Magdalena Luther 15–91542. She died from illness at the age of 13. 4. Martin Luther II 1531–1565. He lived to 34. His cause of death is unknown. 5. Paul Luther 1533–1593. He became a physician and was the longest lived of the 6 children, reaching 60. 6. Marguerite Luther 1534–1570. She married a nobleman, had children, and lived to 36. In addition to their own children, they also raised 4 orphans. Raising so many children meant that simply ensuring they had enough to eat was a challenge. Education could hardly be a priority. The Luther home, located in the former Augustinian monastery known as the Black Cloister, was a bustling center of family life. Katharina von Bora is often portrayed as a capable homemaker who managed extensive property, raised livestock, operated a brewery, and even opened a hospital during epidemics. However, these accounts often stem from the hagiography of Luther's followers. The reality was quite the opposite. After Martin Luther's death, his widow and their many children faced considerable hardship and had to rely on charity. The Augustinian monastery was Catholic property. After being forcibly occupied, it has never been returned to its original owner. It's unclear who should bear responsibility for this. At the time, after the monastery's dissolution, the Elector of Saxony granted a portion of the building to Martin Luther as a residence. Luther and Katharina established a large household there, not only with their own children but also raising several orphans and frequently hosting numerous boarding students and visitors. This implies the house needed significant space to accommodate so many people. Prior to this, Martin Luther enjoyed complete personal protection from Frederick III, the Elector of Saxony, for only 1 year. For most of the other times, he had no special protection. Consequently, he was largely confined to Wittenberg, a princely territory that supported the Reformation. He dared not venture almost anywhere else. His travel was restricted by the Edict of Worms. He could not freely enter Catholic territories, as he risked arrest or immediate execution. In fact, staying in Wittenberg was also dangerous. As the saying goes, living with a ruler is like living with a tiger. The ruler there, Elector Frederick III of Saxony, was a Catholic. This elector merely used Martin Luther to oppose the Holy Roman Emperor, rather than genuinely endorsing Luther's doctrines. Thus, once the emperor's influence waned, Luther's good fortune would also come to an end. This kind of burning the bridge after crossing or discarding the dog after the rabbit is caught tactic is perfectly normal for politicians. Katharina had inherited some assets, including a small farm in Zulsdorf. However, the upheaval of the 30 Years' War that erupted after Luther's death, coupled with poor property management, led to the complete loss of these assets. This further illustrates Katharina's inherent inexperience with secular life as a professional nun, which was particularly evident in her difficult widowhood.
6. Katharina von Bora's widowhood.
Martin Luther's death was a devastating blow to Katharina von Bora. Primarily, she immediately plunged into severe financial hardship because she lost Luther's salary as a professor and pastor. Adding insult to injury, the electoral Saxon family, a potential source of aid, was defeated and imprisoned in the Schmalkaldic War. During the periods of the Augsburg Interim and Leipzig Interim, Katharina was forced to flee Wittenberg, seeking refuge in Magdeburg. Only when the Lutheran princes regained power did she return to Wittenberg, only to find her home and property, the Black Cloister, almost completely ruined. Martin Luther had advised her, after his death, to sell the Black Cloister and move to a more modest dwelling, which would have ensured her financial stability. However, she refused this advice. In his will, Martin Luther designated Katharina as his sole heir. However, a significant legal obstacle arose. In 16th century Saxony, it was illegal for women to inherit property. Consequently, Luther's will had no legal standing, leaving Katharina penniless and homeless. Luther himself was aware that his will did not conform to legal procedures, as he had drafted it without the presence of a public official or lawyer. Martin Luther's deliberate disregard for legal procedure highlights his irresponsibility towards his wife and children. Although Martin Luther's will was handwritten by him, it sparked considerable controversy. He did not follow the common legal procedures of the time, such as having a notary or lawyer formally sign it. He believed that, as a pastor, he had the right to manage his property according to God's law, thus rendering secular legal formalities unnecessary. This reveals Martin Luther's arrogance, hubris, selfishness, and irresponsibility. His stubbornness ultimately destroyed his family's financial security after his death. Despite its legal flaws, Elector Johann Friedrich of Saxony initially intended to honor Martin Luther's wishes and declare the will valid. However, after Luther's death, the elector had concerns and appointed guardians for the children, precisely the situation Luther had most feared. As a result, the will was ultimately declared invalid. If Martin Luther had truly loved his wife and felt responsible for his children, given his numerous illnesses, he should have sold his property beforehand and given the proceeds to his wife to establish an independent household. This would have prevented them from being reduced to living almost entirely on charity.
7. Katharina von Bora's network of charity.
Despite her home being destroyed, Katharina insisted on remaining in Wittenberg. She ultimately managed to survive through the financial generosity of Elector Johann Friedrich and the assistance of other noble patrons such as Duke Albrecht of Prussia and King Christian III of Denmark. She also received financial support from a few friends, barely avoiding starvation. Due to years of war and her own persistent illness, Katharina was forced to leave her home multiple times. During the First Schmalkaldic War, she fled Wittenberg twice and sought refuge in Magdeburg during the periods of the Augsburg Interim and Leipzig Interim. In 1552, she was forced to flee Wittenberg one last time due to crop failures and a severe outbreak of the Black Death. She traveled with her children, Paul and Marguerite, to her hometown of Torgau. Just before reaching Torgau, the horses pulling their carriage were startled. Katharina attempted to calm them but was thrown from the carriage, falling into a ditch and sustaining severe injuries. She was brought to Torgau, where she was paralyzed for 3 months before ultimately succumbing to her injuries at the age of 53. She was buried in Torgau, far from her husband. Whether this arrangement was deliberate is unknown, but it certainly marked the end of this unconventional marriage. As for whether it was a success or failure, posterity will its own judgment.
8. Criticisms of Martin Luther's marriage.
Martin Luther's marriage, as an imperial fugitive plagued by illness, was arguably doomed from its inception. That he narrowly escaped a violent death was already a stroke of immense luck amidst misfortune, yet he astonishingly chose to create a family destined to live with illness in such a precarious existence. His entire family lived under his shadow, in constant insecurity, fear, and dread, never knowing what the next day would bring. Furthermore, he deliberately ensured his family would be penniless after his death. This was the price his entire family had to pay for him to maintain a reputation of incorruptibility. If future pastoral families were to conform to Luther's distorted model, a lifelong commitment to destitution then. To marry a pastor would be to marry into abject poverty. To be born into a pastor's family would be to regret ever being born at all.